Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the third Sunday of Advent, also known as Gaudete Sunday. If you're lighting candles this week, make sure you light the pink one, which this year falls on December 11th.
Unless you don't have a pink one, in which case, stick with blue or purple or whatever.
It's true. I wish that we just had blue all the time, but I also kind of like the pink. Light all the blue candles don't light all of them. Light 3 candles. If you have a pink option, light it. If not, stick with blue or purple.
Just, let the person who knows what they're doing tell you what to do, and you'll be fine. But remember, Jesus says, don't light other people on fire.
Also true, don't light other people on fire, just the candles. Anywho, due to some scheduling conflict, as unsurprisingly happens in December, it is just Kay and I for this episode, no special guest. But don't worry, we will have our special guests back soon, including next week. And Kay and I have studied the Babylonian Exile, so don't you worry, we got your backs.
And it's not all from Wikipedia this time. Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive this week, we are diving into the Babylonian Exile.
Yay!
I know, it's quite surprising since I just said it. But it comes up particularly in our Isaiah reading, so we thought this was a good time to dive into it.
Yes, and I also tend to think of this as the one major historical event in the Bible that has a huge effect on all the other stuff that happens in the Bible that your average Bible reader doesn't know about, or doesn't know a lot about.
Yeah.
So knowing a bit more about this can help a lot of folks. So let's start with a basic timeline of events of what's going on. By the time that we get anywhere near the Babylonian exile in Israel's history, Israel has already been broken up into the northern kingdoms and Judah long beforehand. And all of this story about the Babylonian exile is about Judah, as the northern kingdoms had been broken up as well by the Assyrian Empire over the years. And so we will refer to Judah or Israel probably interchangeably in this podcast, and they are a client state of the Assyrian Empire when all of this starts. So the Judean king Josiah is killed at the Battle of Megiddo in about 609 BCE. Remember, this is before Christ or before the Common Era, depending on which version you're going with. And so the numbers are going to count backwards from what we expect because this is that long ago. So 609 BCE, the Battle of Megiddo, the Judean king Josiah is killed, and so the Babylonian Empire, recognizing that there's been a change in leadership, really comes in and conquers the Assyrian Empire and starts demanding tributes of Israel, and that's in about 605 BCE.
Which is 4 years after 609 BCE.
Right, but anytime there's a change in leadership, you know that the country is weak and easier to take over, as all of us learned in the original Black Panther movie.
Yep.
And so they demand tribute, and a few years later, the Kingdom of Israel, or more specifically, their king Jehoiakim, refuses to pay further tribute in about 598, 597 BCE, basically, is around when that happened. And as a result, Babylon starts cracking down on Israel, and in 587 BCE, the city of Jerusalem and also the temple in Jerusalem are razed. The city in particular was just pretty much leveled from what I'm seeing. People do continue living in other settlements in Judah after this, but Jerusalem is basically wiped off the map, is what it sounds
This
like.
is the first temple, also known as Solomon's Temple.
Right.
So if you are doing more reading about this, there were 2 temples that have been destroyed. And that's kind of when the big sense of the exile begins for the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, the Babylonians took several different groups of people into exile in several different years at this point, but the exile continues for the next several decades.
Yes. And during this time, there is kind of a foretelling of a ruler. So this is who we hear about in the prophets a lot, that will rescue or redeem Israel, that will save Israel from captivity by the Babylonians. And Christians often misinterpret this to signify Christ. So that's part of like hearing about the one who will come to save us. We Christians do that all the time and we think we're talking about Jesus. In this context, it's actually referring to Cyrus, the emperor of Persia. So Cyrus and the Persian Empire actually end up coming in and conquering the Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE. And so that is about 48 years after the initial beginnings of exile and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple.
Sure.
So people have been in exile for quite some time. And then in the next year, in 538 BCE, the Persian Empire sends the captives home. So sends the people who are in exile back to their places of origin. And the year after they get back, the construction of the second temple in Jerusalem begins.
Yeah.
That one stays until the 60s and 70s CE. So
after Jesus.
A good, 500 to 600 years.
Yeah. So what we have here basically is two models of what do you do when you conquer a country, right? Do you take the leadership into slavery in your homeland in order to prevent revolution, which is what Babylon does? Or do you send the captives home and demand reasonable levels of tribute in order to keep people from wanting to revolt in the first place, which is what Persia does? Because we have to remember that as much as Cyrus was hailed as a hero by a lot of the Bible, he was not entirely being altruistic. This wasn't him being, magically wonderful. This was him realizing that, happy people are probably going to produce more stuff. And if they're producing more stuff, then I get a nicer cut of that stuff. And if they're happy, I also don't have to, spend a lot of my time and effort reconquering them all the time. So...
I wish, the people who owned the railroads and the president knew things like that.
Yeah, sick days are important, folks. Cyrus probably knew that too. Of course, back then, sick days maybe were less of a thing because sickness was so much more serious, but yeah. So there's a whole bunch of big names in the time of the Babylonian exile, and knowing a few of those can be helpful.
One of the big names to know is Nebuchadnezzar II. So a lot of us might know Nebuchadnezzar from the story of Daniel and the fiery furnace, which is done every Easter Vigil, but also is just like...
famous children's story for Sunday school.
Yeah, I used to learn it. Like, I used to think it was a bedtime story. So, yeah. I don't know. I don't know if it really was or not. But
I mean, it's kind of a weird bedtime story, but when you think it through, a lot of children's bedtime stories are pretty weird. So...
it's true. So Nebuchadnezzar in this is the emperor of Babylon. Yes. And also Nebuchadnezzar is familiar to many because it is the name of Morpheus's ship in the Matrix movies.
And I suppose Morpheus and his compatriots thought that they were in exile too. So that does seem appropriate.
That's true, yeah.
Also, we have Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, and occasionally mistaken for Jesus by some Christians.
And not to be confused with Miley Cyrus, or Cyrus, Miley, the singer. Yeah. Also, Josiah. Sound familiar, West Wingers? I don't know what the West Winger fandom is actually called. Probably not West Wingers.
It was the 90s. I don't know that they really came up with a fanish name for themselves. The fandom definitely exists, but yeah. I don't think that self-naming thing was as much of a thing.
That's true. Wrong decade. But if it came about now, there'd be some ridiculous nickname.
Actually, I would be fascinated by a West Wing, not remake, but a new version of the West Wing for the modern day, because it would be so much more Xanatos Gambit-y. Everything would be happening on 6 levels at once.
Yeah, that'd be a whole other thing. Anyway, Josiah, in addition to being the president in the West Wing, is the Judean king who is killed at Megiddo.
You might also know the name Megiddo from the book or miniseries version of Good Omens, but also just it shows up a lot in a bunch of end-of-the-world prophecies, that there would be another Battle of Megiddo, and this time, it would be God's armies fighting it, and that kind of thing.
Kind of like Ragnarok.
Yes, sort of.
Oh. Also, Jehoiakim is the next Judean king during Babylon's takeover, who is the one who refused to continue paying tribute and then was killed. And that, clearly went great for him.
Right. And his heir was Jeconiah, and he was taken into exile in Babylon, I believe, almost immediately after his father was killed. And then his heir, Zedekiah, he spent some time as basically Nebuchadnezzar's puppet in Israel for a little while, ruling over the people who were still there. But then also later on, he as well, along with the rest of the educated and rich and powerful folks in Israel, were taken into exile in Babylon too, as a way of preventing revolt and removing those with any education from the area. So there is a whole bunch of the Bible that covers the Babylonian exile, was written during the Babylonian exile, was inspired by the Babylonian exile, etc. We have Jeremiah chapters 39 through 43 were written about the exile itself. Both the end of 2nd Kings and the end of 2nd Chronicles cover the basics of the beginning of the exile from two very different points of view. Daniel chapters 1 through 6 cover some specifics of the exile, and part of Ezekiel too. Ezekiel himself was a major prophet of the exilic period. The Book of Lamentations, the laments in that book are about the Babylonian exile.
More about that later.
Yeah. And Psalm 137 was also inspired by those laments. And then also quite a bit of the Apocrypha, which you may or may not have heard of, depending on your own denomination's religious practices. But books such as Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, First Esdras, chapters 3 through 5, Tobit, and the Book of Judith are all about or inspired by the Babylonian exile.
Also, the books of Daniel and Esther were written during the exile. So it's a big part of it. Also, Isaiah 2, which is chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah, was written at the end of the exile after Cyrus conquered Babylon and allowed people to come back. And so first Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 is pre-exile days, and then the third Isaiah is post-exile days. In 515 to 480. So you have like the first part of Isaiah, then you have the exile, then you have second Isaiah upon returning from exile, and then third Isaiah. So you get Isaiah kind of like bookends it. So I guess like technically not written during, but is a bookend of it.
And I'm sure historians could tell us a lot about the historiography of the difference between writing during an event and writing about the event afterwards, and how those two things wind up being wildly different.
Yes, very different, but also like important to note. And so that's like, even though we're giving a large list of books and knowing that Daniel and Esther were written during the exile, even that, like biblically, there's so much more that is packed in and about the exile, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Yeah, I've mentioned before that in my Hebrew Bible history and literature class, our ongoing joke was that if you didn't know an answer to a question, guess Babylonian exile, and you'll have about a 30 to 40% chance of being right. So
yeah, that makes sense. And then also Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books cover the return to Israel from exile and the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem. So those are all the biblical places where you can find more information, and we'll include a bunch of links in the episode description for where we got our information from. And feel free to give us feedback if you have more information or want to share more about it.
Also, if you want to look into the Bible and how it covers the exile, one interesting option would be looking at a chronological Bible where the books are mixed up in order of when they were written instead of what order are they traditionally in the Bible, and that could be super helpful.
A lot of times those are in like the read the Bible through in a year kind of framing, but you don't have to read it through in a year in order to read the chronological version.
Yeah, and it does give you a very different perspective.
So some of the impacts of the Babylonian exile, there are some big kind of obvious impacts of disconnect from culture and murder and dispossession of land.
Cultural genocide.
Cultural genocide, which is what exile is. And we're not going to get really deep into that. So part of the exile and that sort of thing is the people who stayed and who married with those who moved into the area, and that sort of a thing became the group that is known as the Samaritans. So all of them descended from the same family group, but the Samaritans were likely not sent into exile and then intermarried when they were still hanging out in Israel, which interreligious marriage is a complicated thing in Judaism. And so we are not like about to dive into that
Oh
complicated
no,
thing.
that sounds like 3 deep
But
dives.
there is,
Yeah.
yeah, suffice it to say, there are complications in that. And
Yeah.
that is part of why in the Gospels, especially when Samaritan comes up, it is someone who is more or less despised by the Jewish people. It is kind of a mutual enmity thing because of some of that stuff.
Complicated family relationships.
Yes. Family systems. Hey, look, you could do a family systems on the
I don't
Abrahamic
think we
faith.
should. I think maybe someone who is actually
No.
like of those faiths could. But yes,
Yeah.
we should.
I mean, we are of those faiths, Abrahamic traditions, but
Well, yes, but I
more
think Christians
specifically,
have
you
been
could do
telling
it
Jewish
like,
people enough things for a long time.
oh
So
yeah. I don't think we should do it. I think it should be a family
yeah.
systems person, actually.
Well, that too.
Ideally, Jewish or Muslim or both. Anyway, so there are also other impacts that are kind of more impacts on Judaism in particular. And so in this shift into exile, the reading of the Torah becomes really central because that is a key marker of their faith that
Sure.
they have access to. It is one of the few things that they have access to because they no longer have access to the temple or to Jerusalem.
Right.
And so that also creates a shift from a temple-based religion where everyone is expected to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, is expected to worship at the temple, into a more synagogue-based system where people gather locally at synagogues for worship and for their faith practices.
Sure.
And that has kind of continued through to today, although there are a variety of ways that it kind of comes back and goes away, and
yeah, that's true.
Ebbs and flows, I guess, is the word. Yeah.
This is also when the Talmud is produced, specifically the Babylonian Talmud, because I believe there's actually a couple of those from
Yes,
different time
Babylonian
periods.
and Jerusalem.
Yes. And so the
the two
Babylonian
that I
one
know of.
is produced during the exile as a way of practicing and interacting with their faith while they're in exile. Also, given the time of year, I feel like we should mention that you all may be hearing a few Christmas carols that bring up the Babylonian captivity, and one of them that you are probably hearing right now during Advent is O Come, Emmanuel, the very first verse of which continues, "And ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear." Of course, remember that that Son of God that is actually talking about is not so much Jesus as it is Cyrus, but it's a traditional Christmas carol and it's really pretty, so Advent.
Yeah, but it's important. There's so much to dig deep in for this stuff.
Yes.
That's an important piece to always hold in our minds and in our thinking.
And how we talk about all this.
Yeah, and all of the big Christian holidays have a lot of potential to cause a lot of harm to Jewish people and to Judaism.
Yes.
And we don't want that. So within Judaism, in the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of the month of Av, is the day that commemorates the destruction of both the first temple and the second temple, and also a commemoration of a people of exile, which is largely how the Jewish community has understood itself and has lived. And so it is an annual fast day within Judaism. It, as I said, it commemorates and remembers the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonian Empire and the second temple by the Roman Empire in Jerusalem, which are said to have both happened on that same day. It is a time of fasting and mourning, which goes from sundown until the following sundown. And in the synagogue, the book of Aikach, which is what we call the Book of Lamentations, is chanted, as are Kinot, which are dirges that were written during the Middle Ages. Folks sit on low stools, which is a custom associated with mourning the dead, and Jews read sections of the books of Jeremiah and Job, as well as passages from the Bible and the Talmud that deal with the temple's destruction in 586 BCE and 70 CE. So this is the big day of lament in the whole year. I think the closest we get as Christians is probably Good Friday as like some sort of day of lament.
Yeah, because we approach All Saints rather
religion,
differently. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is literally the Holy of Holies is destroyed. The places that hold such great importance to our faith and to our religion is destroyed, and so we mourn. Whereas Yom Kippur is more about repentance, this is more about grief and mourning.
Yeah. So, as for pop culture references, we did give a few already, and now that I'm thinking about it, actually, Josiah really does suit the president in
Mm-hmm.
West Wing, not so much for him himself, but during the series, we learn that his father was a non religious headmaster of a private school who thought quite highly of himself, and he probably
Mm-hmm.
wanted a somewhat obscure biblical name that was still reasonably mainline, easy to pronounce. And so Josiah, as you know, a Judean king that got killed, he wouldn't probably have the context for knowing who Josiah in the Bible was, but it does,
Right.
sound good, and so that's
Mm-hmm.
possibly why he would have picked it, and that does seem to be in character for him.
Yeah, and it does sound like very Puritan.
Yes, it's a lovely name, and yet it has this complicated history. But also, separate from those other references we made, you may also be thinking of the TV show Babylon 5, which
Mm-hmm.
is a show about a space station in a multi species spacefaring civilizations melodrama. It's a complicated and very dramatic TV show that was impressively well written, especially for the 90s, and involves a lot of politics and complicated motivations and people generally being interesting and people being people despite being different species. And
Hmm.
the space station itself is named Babylon 5 because there were 4 previous space stations that were all either like destroyed or like fell apart over time, and Babylon 5 is the only one that continued to survive. And I don't remember offhand the reason why the other 4 fell apart or were destroyed, but I think it's kind of along the lines of that bit in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where the guy is telling his son that you will inherit all of this land, and is talking about the previous castles. And, I built a castle and it fell into the swamp, and so I built another castle and that one fell into the swamp, and so then on top of those castles I built this castle and it hasn't fallen into the swamp yet. And so I don't think there was a swamp for the other Babylon 5 space stations to fall into, but it's about that level of, look, making major construction projects in space has to be risky and tricky, and apparently it took them a while to figure all that out. So,
Mm-hmm.
our first reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 10. The prophet Isaiah foresees the return of the exiles from Babylon as joyful and healing, with all brokenness restored and God saving the people.
So, one of the themes in this passage is the idea of return. Isaiah is talking about return, 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 and the gift of what it shall be to return. And yet it is complicated, right? So, it's part of this Sunday being Gaudete Sunday, is joy, but in the midst of grief and sorrow. And so, I was thinking about in the Hunger Games, Katniss goes back to District 12 a couple times, and the first time doesn't quite fit for this, but when she goes back the final time at the end of the third book, she goes back to District 12 and the war is over and bodies have been buried and now there are flowers growing again. And so I just have this image of the people, the exiles, where so much destruction happened when they left, and then they are finally coming back and flowers are starting to bloom again.
Yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah, yeah. And then in verse 1, we read, "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus." And I couldn't help think of the Kalahari Desert. So there's a documentary about elephants on Disney Plus that I love because I love elephants.
Yes.
And it starts out at the Okavango River Delta, which is in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. And so when the rains come, they flood the Okavango, and they depict it on a map in this like really beautiful way where all of the like light brown then just like becomes green, and you can see it spreading from the delta, and all of this vegetation all of a sudden coming into existence that before looked like just dead and sparse, and it was just waiting for the water.
Yeah.
Waiting for the water to return.
Mm-hmm. And then in verse 2a, we read, "It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing." And yes, about this whole the desert blossoming thing, that is actually a thing that happens. And it's depicted a couple of times that I know of in fiction. In these cases, it's not a long-term blossoming. It's like a one-day special event kind of thing of, even over the desert, eventually a rain cloud will come occasionally,
Mm-hmm.
and when that rain falls for one day, these glorious flowers will spring up, and then the next day it'll all dry up and wither away again. And so the two fictional portrayals of this that I know of, there's one in one of the Dragon Prince books by Melanie Ron. I don't offhand remember which one of those it is, but there is a bit where one of the deserts blossom. And then also, for those of us who grew up playing the computer game Myst, there are a few books that were written on the background of that story. And one of them is called Myst, the Book of Atris, which is about the main character's sort of grandfather. And in that, in his childhood, there is also a day when the desert that he lives in blooms.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And those books were actually way better than I expected them to be honest. Like,
That
I
is
was not
always a
expecting
gift.
a lot, but they turned out pretty good. Yeah.
Nice. And then in verse 8, we read, "A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fools, shall go astray." So that is a complicated sentence, and who we are counting as unclean and not unclean. And is this and everybody will be clean because God will make it so? Or is this a super problematic, we're just kicking out everybody who's deemed unclean because they have chronic illnesses or something? So just to know that that's a complicated thing and not a super clear thing. But also, I was thinking about it, and the song that came to mind was, "They paved paradise, put up a parking lot." I'm not singing it quite right, but
It's pretty close.
yeah.
It's Joni Mitchell.
Which it's also somebody else. I think there have been a lot of covers on this because
Yes.
I think
Very
I
much.
did not hear the Joni Mitchell version as my first version, but I like that idea because it's like the idea that they're trying to go for is that it's a very accessible highway where you can't get lost, but also
Yes.
there's this like, if we're making a highway, we're paving through or over something, and that seems
But
complicated.
if it's a paved highway instead of a dirt highway, then you would be much cleaner, wouldn't you?
I mean,
While traveling on.
physically,
Yes.
but morally, ethically, I don't know.
Yeah, well, as you would put it, details, details. And then in verse 9 we read, "No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come up on it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there." Well, okay, so no lions and no ravenous beasts, and like anyone who has grown up spending any time on the internet, which is meant primarily for cat pictures, would know that all cats are ravenous beasts and have never been fed by anyone ever in the history of the universe, and therefore
It's true.
we are all terribly cruel. And so it sounds like there are no actual cats on this highway, and I object. And I'm not entirely sure I want to go there. So I'm just saying.
Fair point, fair point. Yeah, that's a whole different.
Yeah, like it can't be the road to heaven if there are no cat pictures. I object. Or cats.
Okay, but what about those of us who are allergic to cats? Can we
Well,
also have
that's what the
dogs?
cat pictures are for. You can't have an
Okay,
allergic reaction to a picture of a cat.
that's true. Although the skeleton guard did have an allergic reaction to Dante, the dog in Coco, and he didn't even have a nose.
That sounds complicated.
Explain that. Yeah, it's a hilarious, one-off
Sure.
thing. But our second reading for this episode is James chapter 5, verses 7 through 10. The author instructs us to be patient for the return of Christ, just as farmers are patient with their crop.
Yeah.
Ish.
They try.
Yeah. So this idea of patience reminded me of the trope for it is like the Groundhog Day loop, but it's happened in a variety of places. Doctor Who, I think, messes around with it a lot. But there's this what's going to happen.
Sure.
Because you're reliving the event again and again and again. But there's also this sense, the idea I had in my head is like the patience of it, where you're like, everybody's like, ah, and then you're just like, mm-hmm. And then they come out and then the thing is solved that everybody's freaking out about, but you knew it was coming. The solution was coming momentarily anyway. So I was thinking about that. And that kind of comes up in A New York Christmas Wedding at the end, spoilers, where the main character ends up going back to her younger self and so knows what's going to happen because it has already happened and is able to then like preemptively respond and understand. She still gets confused because she didn't really realize that that's what was happening.
Yeah, I don't know that as my younger self that I would want to listen to my older self. Like, I know my
No,
younger
it's
self,
not
and I don't
like
think that would have gone well.
it's not like going back like that. It's like becoming her younger self.
Oh, okay. I don't think I'd
Yeah.
want to do that either, but sure.
I don't know that I would want to do that either. Then in verse 7, we read, "Be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains." But what about frosts? Do they only get one frost? Did you know that carrots are actually sweeter after the frost? Also, giants in the earth, which I did not read during my Paideia first year class at Luther College, apparently depicted the discovery, which is probably not the first time it's discovered, but the time that Norwegian immigrants realized that there were strains of wheat that actually did better after a late frost.
Sure, I would expect there to be, yeah. Also, does this mean that you can only eat carrots during second breakfast instead of first breakfast?
Yes, but then you also have like 11sies and supper and dinner.
I mean, you can also eat carrots then, I suppose, just not probably during early breakfast.
Sure. Yeah, too early. Hasn't finished frosting yet.
And then in verse 8 we read, "You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near." And, if you strengthen your heart enough, it might grow 3 sizes, just like the Grinch's.
Exactly.
So keep doing those heart exercises, I guess.
Indeed. And don't, as we read in verse 9, beloved, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. And I would just like to say, as a sibling, this is impossible. It is impossible for siblings. There will always be grumbling. No matter how well you do or think you get along, there will always be cause for grumbling. And that's okay, because presumably you still love and care about each other. But yeah, the no grumbling. Also, go ahead. Judge, help us decide, help us arbitrate. Clearly we're not doing it well because we're grumbling at each other. We need the judgment. Not the judgment of going to hell, but the judgment of Hebrew Bible judges who were arbiters of and who helped mediate.
And yet somehow, during their childhood, siblings are so unlikely to want the judgment of their parents or adults between them.
Details.
Yeah. Somehow I knew you'd say that. Mm-hmm. And finally, in verse 10, we read, "As an example of suffering and patience, beloved, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." And I would maybe put a tiny caveat on this of, some of the prophets, sure, several of them even. Maybe not so much Jonah. Don't take Jonah as an example of patience. You could probably take him as an example of suffering, but not serious suffering. After all, having the plant you were sitting under die is not exactly a giant travesty. So,
I mean, you could take them as an example of how not to suffer or be patient.
Yes. Yeah, probably.
And what it's not like to suffer because, not gleefully watching the destruction of other people is not actually suffering.
Yeah. And then our gospel reading for today is from Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 through 11. From prison, John the Baptist sends his disciples to find out if Jesus is the Messiah sent to save Israel. Jesus' answer confirms his identity, and then he tells those with him about John.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of curiosity, right? John sends the disciples because he is curious about Jesus, which is a little bit ironic given that traditionally they're cousins born 3 months apart. So, okay.
I mean, if you grew up with your cousin, would you spend a lot of time asking them if they were the child of God?
I guess not. That's true.
That seems awkward. John would have known that Jesus' parents were Joseph and Mary. And asking him if he also had a heavenly father might have started some rumors. So
that would have been fantastic. I love it. Yeah. But it reminded me of the end of The Expanse TV show where there is a family on one of the ring planets, and one of the kids, the daughter, is very curious about everything. She's curious about animals and plants, and they're all some of them seem familiar and some of them are very different animals and plants and stuff. And ultimately, it does save her brother's life. Though who knows what else happens as a result of that. But her brother's life is saved because she has like found out that these certain animals can regenerate life.
Huh, okay. And so in verse 5, we read, "The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." And as I read this passage, which is largely about healing, I think to myself, I've explored a decent chunk of the X Men franchise. I've seen a lot of the Marvel movies and like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show and stuff like that. And what I haven't seen, but I remain curious to see, is the exploration of what it would be like to have the superpower of being able to heal by touch, and then also having to like avoid other people knowing that you have that superpower, because then you'd wind up getting like kidnapped by the government and dissected and slash being experimented on. Like this would be an incredibly dangerous superpower to have because other people would want to reproduce it, but also like you would probably want to reproduce it. You would probably want to be able to share it with others. You'd want to be able to heal people. And so like where's that balance between healing as many people as you can and also not outing yourself as having this ability so that you can maintain some control over your life? And where are the lines for that? I think that there's a lot of dramatic scope in that story, but I don't think I've seen someone explore that before, and I think it could be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, in Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's childhood pal, Joshua, the Jesus character, at one point is just like walking around or walking through the crowd and is like, healed that one, cleansed that one, cast out demons from that one, and just like touching
Nice.
people.
Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah. And then in verse 8, we read, "What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces." Which made me think of the movie Oliver and Company, the animated movie, where Oliver is a cat and like it's a pet animated movie and stuff. And Georgette, who is the pet in this like very wealthy house, and Oliver like falls in with them and is kind of taken in by them. But there's like Georgette is spoiled rotten, and it is decidedly like the epitome of dressed in soft robes, even as a pet.
Sure. And then in verse 9a, we read, "What then did you go out to see? A prophet?" And like this just reminded me of one of the conversations that I continually have to have with not just my confirmation students, but also like anytime I'm doing a Bible study, I wind up having to have this conversation with the folks I'm talking to. But this is one of those ways that you can tell that they didn't have professional sports or TV back then. Ways number 674 or whatever. Because, like, if your method of entertaining yourself is going out into the wilderness and looking at this weird guy who's decided that he's a prophet of God, you probably don't have a lot else to do on a Thursday afternoon. I'm just saying.
That's fantastic. Yeah. In verse 11, we read, "Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the reign of heaven is greater than he." So many greater may have arisen since, just not born of women, because trans people can also give birth. And yeah, it's talked about mostly as like seahorse parenting, where people who are not women are the ones who carry the fetus to term. And I like that. I like that analogy.
Yeah, sounds good.
And now for our goofiest segment, let's make a Muppets musical. Who are you casting for today, Kay?
Well, flashing back to our James reading, when it comes to a prophet to not take as an example of suffering and patience, I realized that because we don't actually read from the book of Jonah very often, I don't think we've cast Jonah yet in the Muppets musical, and we definitely need a Jonah, and I really think Jonah himself does need to be a Muppet, and I think New Zealand would be an excellent choice. He shows up several times in the Muppets, and he is the orange Muppet character who has a humanish appearance with a big red nose and a black mustache and hair. And he's pretty goofy. He's often kind of clownish, and he likes to throw fish at people, as one does. And I
That seems perfect for Jonah.
Yeah, and
throwing
I
fish
think
at
that he
people.
could like ham up the whole Jonah thing because Jonah really is a ham character, and he could have a lot of fun with that. So yeah, I think New Zealand would be a good pick for that.
Yeah. And as we talked about in our first season, well, I'll try and link to this episode, but our first season, we had River Needham on as a guest and talked about Jonah. And
Yes.
Jonah is satire, so it makes sense that New Zealand and Jonah would be like hamming it up together and being over the top awful. Yeah.
How about you, Emily?
I think that is a wonderful casting. So I was having trouble thinking about who to cast.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense in which I could see Miss Piggy as John the Baptist, of like, she would, in this particular one, where she's like sending someone else to figure this out for her, except that
Okay.
she's sending somebody else because, you know, she's in jail, which is like,
She would
maybe
not
not
like that.
ideal.
No.
Yeah. But I could see a variety of Muppets being the ones to like go ask for John, right? If it were like the Yip Yips or even like Beaker. I could see like Beaker going and being like, I think mostly because we were just like searching Beaker for the orange person and we were searching for Lou and Beaker kept coming up. But yeah.
Yeah, well, now I'm getting the mental picture of Beaker trying to go and communicate things on behalf of John the Baptist, and since he only meeps, that would probably like involve a lot of charades and and then having to go and take the message back to John the Baptist in prison and trying to tell John all the things that Jesus had said. And that strikes me as a really excellent Muppet sketch, and I totally want to see that now. So
that is fantastic. Yeah. All right. I'm glad we like got somewhere because I was like not at all sure about.
Sure.
Yeah.
That would be a good time.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the fourth Sunday of Advent with our special guest, Pace Warfield. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It is cheaper than moving, whether it's into exile or a block down the street. So
Absolutely.
much cheaper.
Yeah. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax Vobiscum.